My name is Daniel Bernhard. I'm the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. We are a national charity that aspires to a Canada where people from around the world don't just come to live, but stay, become citizens, succeed, and by virtue of that success contribute to Canada's future as a prosperous nation, as a place where it's exciting to live and where we'd all like to build a future and raise our families. This morning, the Institute for Canadian Citizenship is releasing the second installment of the Leaky Bucket, a report which examines Canada's immigration retention performance up to the year 2020. We're very grateful to the Conference Board of Canada for serving as our research partner again, and to Statistics Canada for providing the data upon which these findings are based. Last year's study attracted significant attention. It showed that Canada's onward migration rate, that's immigrants leaving Canada, had been creeping up for decades with severe spikes in 2017 and 2019. Nobody noticed because nobody bothered to check. This year's findings offer a sobering confirmation of the prior trend. The number of immigrants leaving Canada reached an all-time high in 2020. Despite extreme pandemic travel restrictions, immigrants found ways to leave the country in record numbers, and despite multiple opportunities to return, they chose not to. A majority of Canadians have now become convinced that immigration is responsible for our most costly national failings, from housing to healthcare, even traffic congestion. But those who want Canada to dramatically reduce the scope of immigration and to focus exclusively on the highest skilled immigrants will sadly find no comfort in the results that we published today. The study we're publishing this morning shows that highly coveted economic immigrants, people who are hand-selected for their skills and expertise, are actually the most likely to leave the country. And while Canada will lose 20% of all immigrants over the coming 20 years, that number spikes to 35% among Francophone immigrants. Nearly half of all Francophones who leave Canada lived in Quebec at the time of departure. Temporary workers have, of course, become a hot topic recently, but actually this data reveal that they are the most likely to stay in Canada after obtaining permanent residence. This year's Leaky Bucket also reveals striking regional differences. Most of the immigrants leaving BC, Ontario, and Quebec were living in the big cities at the time of departure, but in the Atlantic provinces, for example, most of the people who are leaving lived outside of the big cities. Those who left the Atlantic provinces also left faster, with a greater exodus in the early years after landing. We further learned that immigrants from some countries are actually far more likely to leave than others, and leavers from these countries are also far more likely to have obtained Canadian citizenship prior to departing. So what does all of this mean for Canada? That's the important question. I'd say that the most sobering implication is that the two categories of immigrants Canada prioritizes most, those are economic immigrants and Francophones, are actually the least likely to make Canada their forever home. Now, Canada has a strong national interest in retaining immigrants who bring invaluable economic and language skills to our shores, but simply opening the door is not enough. We must take a broader view of settlement services, going beyond mere support for people in need to a perspective that actually sells immigrants on Canada as a permanent home in those crucial early years. We also need to discover some urgency here. This year's report confirmed last year's findings that immigrant retention is very time sensitive. The risk of departure is highest between the third and seventh year after landing, and we have a national obligation and a national interest in making those years truly excellent. These findings raise some tough questions about our selection priorities. Should a person's likelihood of remaining to contribute over the long term factor into our admission criteria? Another major implication is that a highly diverse country such as ours requires a highly diverse toolkit. There are striking retention differences between language groups, between entry categories and regions and province of residence. So we need targeted, flexible, and localized strategies for each case. But most importantly, this is an urgent wake-up call to Canada. We would do quite well, frankly, to get over ourselves. This is a beautiful and bountiful country. It's given us so much, but our prevailing understanding of immigration is unfortunately really quite backwards. Immigration is not just a manifestation of our generosity. It is a manifestation of our ambition. And more importantly, it is an admission that an aging, shrinking society is a weaker, poorer, and less interesting one. So a truly welcoming society does more than just open its doors. It offers hospitality, friendship, and fulfillment. When immigrants from around the world grow enthusiastic about Canada and become excited to play for our team, then we can all grow to have and become more. Je vais donner un commentaire en français, après je passe.
I'll be making a few words in French, and then I will pass the floor to Mr. Monteiro, the author of the report. So, hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Bernhard. I am the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. We are a non-for-profit organization. We foresee a Canada open to all countries of the world, that people come here, but come here to stay, to become Canadian citizens, and that they find success, and because of this success, that they contribute to our shared future. The Institute published today its second edition of the report titled The Leaky Bucket, looking at the flux of onward immigration in Canada to 2020. The Institute wishes to thank the Conference Board of Canada as a research partner, as well as Statistics Canada for the data provided. Now, the first edition of the Leaky Bucket was very successful in terms it interested a great many parties. Apparently, the number of immigrants that have left Canada has been creeping ever upwards for decades, with severe spikes in 2017 and 2019. Nobody noticed because nobody bothered to check. This year's findings offer a sobering confirmation of the trend. The number of immigrants leaving Canada reached an all-time high in 2020, and this despite extreme pandemic travel restrictions. Immigrants found ways to leave in record numbers, and despite multiple opportunities to return, they chose not to. A majority of Canadians have been convinced that immigration is responsible for most costly national failings, from housing, affordable housing, that is, access to health care, and even traffic, and perhaps losing the French language. But those who want Canada to dramatically reduce the scope of immigration to focus exclusively on the highest skilled immigrants will find no comfort in the results we published today. The study shows that highly coveted economic immigrants, hand-selected for their skills and experience, are the most likely to leave. Whereas we lose some 20% of immigrants over 20 years, this number spikes to 35% among Francophone immigrants. And approximately of those Francophones who leave the country leave from Quebec City, or rather Quebec, the province. The matter of temporary workers have become a hot topic, but they're most likely to stay in Canada after obtaining permanent residency. The 2024 report also reveals striking differences across Canada's regions. Most of the immigrants leaving BC, Ontario, and Quebec lived in major cities before departing, whereas those who left from Atlantic Canada lived outside these big urban centers. The Atlantic provinces also lose many more people in their years after landing. Our study further shows that immigrants from some countries are far more likely to depart than others. And they are also more likely to have secured Canadian citizenship before departure. So then, what does this all mean for Canada? The most sobering implication is that of the immigrants who come to Canada, those who are part of the two priority categories, economic immigrants and francophones, are those least likely to make Canada their forever home. Canada has a strong national interest in retaining immigrants with invaluable economic and language skills. It's simply opening the door is not enough. We need to take a much broader view of settlement services, going beyond supporting people in need to services that sell immigrants on Canada as a permanent home in those crucial early years. We need to discover some urgency. This year's report confirmed last year's finding that immigrant retention is time sensitive. The risk of departure is highest 3 to 7 years after landing. We need to make those early years excellent. These findings raise tough questions about our priorities. Should a person's likelihood of remaining to contribute over the long-term factor into our admission decisions? Another major implication is that a highly diverse country requires a highly diverse toolkit. There are striking differences between language groups and entry categories and regions of residence. We need targeted, flexible, localized strategies for each case. But most importantly, this is an urgent wake-up call for Canada. We would need to rethink the situation. We live in a beautiful and bountiful country that has given us so much, but our prevailing understanding of immigration is completely backwards. Immigration is not just a manifestation of our generosity. It is an admission that an aging, shrinking society is a weaker, poorer, and less interesting one. A truly welcoming society does more than just open its doors. It offers hospitality, friendship, and fulfillment. When immigrants from around the world grow enthusiastic about Canada and become excited to play for our team, we can all grow. That is something that will allow us to prosper all together. To know more about this report of the Institute, please go to our website, and I will now give the floor to Stein Monteiro,
who can address some of the technical questions that you may have and speak a little bit further to the details. So thank you for your patience, for hearing me out so far. Stein, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. So we are pleased to report that that our report, Leaky Bucket 2024, a closer look at immigrant onward migration in Canada, is now publicly available from 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. We would like to extend our gratitude to the Institute of Canadian Citizenship for their support in this research. The purpose of this report is to provide a snapshot of immigrants that are leaving Canada, when they are leaving, and who is leaving. The report provides one piece of a very large puzzle on how to retain immigrants in the short term and the long term, and where we need to target our retention efforts. The report presents the onward migration rate as a key measure to understand immigrants' rate of departure. The onward migration rate is calculated using data from Statistics Canada's Longitudinal Immigration Database, or the IMDB for short, linked to individual tax filer information. The study uses fiscal non-activity as a proxy for onward migration. An immigrant is counted as an onward migrant if they do not have a T1 family file for 2 consecutive years and have never filed a T1 again by 2021, which is also the last tax year in the dataset. The study is restricted to immigrants that have been granted permanent residency between 1982 and 2019, were adults 18 plus when they were first granted permanent residency, and filed taxes in Canada at least once since arriving. In this iteration of the Leaky Bucket report, in addition to updating our knowledge with the 2019 cohort and one additional tax year, we also provide additional information on the onward migration rate by region of departure, by immigration class of arrival, by whether they have previously held a study or work permit, by mother tongue, and by previous country of citizenship. The report highlights that most immigrants that have left do so within the first 5 years of gaining permanent residency, with Francophones and former international students being the most at risk of leaving. The Atlantic region and economic immigrants also show very high departure rates. These findings are also key to improving how we support and retain our immigrant communities. This research raises new questions about why immigrants are leaving, and we hope to conduct more research into this area. I look forward to discussing more about this issue over the next little while. We welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
Donc, c'est le moment pour les questions.
It is now time for questions.
In the room, raise your hand. If you are online, please raise your hand, and I'll recognize you. First question to Michel Sabat, Presse Canadien.
Oui, bonjour.
Good morning. Given the departure of Francophone immigrants from Ontario, the target of the Government of Canada, 10% outside Quebec, is that a realistic objective? I attended an event with Mr. Miller last week, and his approach is based on the fact that we have to build Francophone communities outside of Quebec. It is not satisfactory to find oneself alone as a Francophone immigrant in a different community. Now, is this solution practical? We shall see. But the data reveals that it is important not only to attract and support Francophone immigrants, but also to retain Francophone immigrants so that they can contribute to our culture and the bilingual character of Canada. So it is very important to see that there are two sides to this coin. We talk about people who come to Canada, but I hope that thanks to this data, we will also now talk about those who actually stay and who become enthusiastic. I'm not sure I received a clear answer. I don't know if it's realistic or not, but I'll go with my second question, and perhaps you can add to what you've said. Now, the decision of the Quebec government to freeze 2 programs of immigration, will that not only incur a greater departure from Francophone immigrants from Quebec? I don't know. I was not trying to avoid the question. It's just very hard to foresee what questions will be put to us. As to the government of Quebec and its strategy, in my opinion, it is a debate that is ongoing because we talk about the French language being threatened and that we have to welcome Francophone immigrants. But according to our data, half of the immigrants who leave Canada were based in Quebec. So the challenge of retention is quite the challenge. It's much more than just being qualified in speaking French, you see. There is a challenge of affordable housing, cultural integration, having friends, colleagues, social networks, and all of that. Immigrants need much more than being competent in the language. To reduce the number of immigrants is one thing, but we have to acknowledge that there are problems with retention. The experience of immigrants is very important because a Francophone who leaves is not a Francophone that is going to contribute to the French character of Quebec. Thank you. I also have a question about Francophone immigration in Ontario. Now, in your study, you say that the rate of onward migration compared to the proportion of Francophone immigrants who established themselves in Ontario. So what is the distinction with Ontario? The data is right off the press. Perhaps we need to do more research to understand why Francophones who live in Ontario leave in such high numbers compared to those who are immigrants, not Francophone, but who live in other provinces. I suspect, however, that there aren't enough social supports. If someone is welcomed as a Francophone, and because he or she speaks French, it's his mother tongue, but there are no other Francophones in the environment, well, that welcome isn't enough, you see. The strategy of the Government of Canada's strategy to increase the number of French-speaking immigrants that reside outside of Quebec, perhaps that strategy needs to be thought out very carefully. Now, you talk about Francophone immigrants. You also talk about economic immigrants. Is there any kind of correlation between the two? The economic immigrants are in greater number because they actually speak French and have a better access to the labor market. Do you see a correlation between the fact that there are many economic migrants leaving and many Francophone immigrants leaving as well? I'll give the floor over to Stein to speak to you about any intersectionality between the two, or correlation, if you will. There is an infinite number of combinations out there, but what I would like to say, as I recall, there are many different subsets of data. Last year, in our study, we published the number of people leaving the country. That's it, that's all. But at this time, we are looking at the category, mother tongue, province of residence, and so on. The data is much richer now because we are breaking it down into these subsets, and everything depends on the angle. Now, if you're interested in international studies, or if you're interested in economic immigrants or Francophone immigrants, what we're saying is you have to have the data required to speak to this. Now, Stein, do you...
Are economic immigrants, like what the overlap is there? I'm not aware that the data has this, but perhaps you know.
Yeah, we do have data on economic immigration, as well as how many people are leaving from Quebec and whether they're Francophone, as well as outside Quebec. That intersection is not something that we looked at in this particular report. Right. I could add also, based on some of the other questions that were raised, that that Francophones seem to be leaving at a higher rate outside of Quebec, particularly in Ontario, compared to Anglophones and Allophones. So, and the way that we sort of approached the question of mother tongue was more to look at Francophones as a community rather than as a language issue specifically. Right, so it might be broader than specifically whether a person speaks English or French, but more sort of a systemic issue in the community itself. Yeah.
Okay. Next question, David Baxter, Canadian Press.
Hi there, and thanks for taking your questions. And just keep going on the Francophone immigrant side. Did you find reasons why Francophones are leaving in just generally greater numbers than their Anglophone counterparts? Is it just generally that, well, Canada is a bilingual country, English culture is just much more prevalent nationally, or like what kind of factors were you seeing there?
So I'll commit the first PR sin and talk about something that's not in the report. But first, let me talk about what's in the report. So this report is just data from StatsCan about who is still here and who is gone. So there's no public opinion research, etc. We can't really speculate as to why. However, the Institute for Canadian Citizenship has another study, which is public opinion research, which we've conducted on over 20,000 verified adult immigrants. And we've asked them about the reasons why they're likely to stay, or why they're likely to leave, rather. And among Francophones and Anglophones, actually, affordability is the number one cause for concern, with housing affordability being at the top of the list. And interestingly enough, affordability is listed as a top concern no matter your income. So people who are making less money and people who are making over $200,000 a year are just as likely to say that housing affordability is a problem. I think what this means is that there is an optimism gap with people who have extreme amounts of global opportunity. Canada has become a highly selective country when it comes to immigration. Our admission rate in the normal permanent residence pool is about 4% in the point system. That's about the same admission rate as Harvard University. So it's very, very competitive to get in, and that means that people who are coming have many options. And if Canada can't sell them on staying, then they will go elsewhere. Amongst Francophones, I should say that there are two factors that we can speculate on, I think, reasonably. One is for people who are outside of Quebec. that there's just simply not a critical mass of other French speakers in many of these communities to make the experience truly welcoming and worthwhile. But the interesting fact is about Francophones who are within Quebec. There's a lot of speculation that immigrants who don't succeed in Quebec don't succeed because of their failure to integrate and to learn the language. But we see that actually the rate of departure in Quebec among Anglophones and Francophones as mother tongue is almost identical. So perhaps there are other factors here that are at play that maybe we're talking about less but ought to be investigating more.
Yeah, and you answered this a bit already on the just the competitiveness side, but on the economic immigrant file, just what would you like to see the government doing? Just to also just have this quotes. I know the recommendations are in the report, but just to have some more quotes on it as well. Like, what should the government be doing to try to help retain these people, since they are so valuable to Canada's labor force overall?
Absolutely. So we have a few recommendations in this respect. First and foremost, we think that the government should adopt binding retention targets, which they report on annually in conjunction with their admissions targets. What doesn't get measured doesn't get done, and so this, I think, is a very important focus. I think in addition to that, we are calling on the federal government, but also provincial governments, to take a broader view of settlement services. Right now, we have services for people who are in need of things, whose language abilities, for example, are maybe not up to scratch, or whose CV is not up to scratch. And we offer services to sort of improve them so that they can succeed in Canada. Well, there's a whole range of economic immigrants who don't need those supports, who speak English or French already very, very well, who have extreme qualifications, etc. And Canada needs to recognize that we provide services not just for people who are in need, but that we are in need of them. And so we need to have services that sell them on Canada as a place to stay and to contribute their talents in the long term. And the last thing I'll say is that the job of welcoming people and on selling talented folks from around the world on becoming Canadian, on playing for our team, is more than just a government responsibility. And even within government, it's more than just a responsibility of the Immigration Ministry. This is something that we can do as public servants, as elected officials, but also as employers, as neighbors, as colleagues. A welcome is a whole experience. It's not just about dollars and cents or a specific income. It's about whether your kids are able to play sports and have a good experience here. It's about whether you have friends and whether you have optimism that this decision to move to Canada, to give up so much from your country of origin, will pay off in the future. If you remain optimistic about the prospects of that investment, you're very likely to continue contributing your talent and energy to Canada's success. So this is an all-of-Canada effort, and each one of us in little ways can help to improve that experience so that we're not losing this talent, which is hand-selected to address needs that we have, particularly in the labor force. Immigrants are increasingly disappearing from the country, but sadly our shortages in housing, in the housing workforce, in early childhood education, and in healthcare, those needs are not disappearing.
Okay, now we're going to go to the questions online. First up is David Thurton from CBC.
Hi, folks. Good morning. Is it fair to say that the immigration system is a leaky bucket if we don't have more recent data? If I'm looking at your report, it says the most recent available data is from 2020.
The most recent available data is, yes, from 2020, but this is actually a long-term study that looks at people who have arrived since 1982. So we've seen this trend increase steadily over 30 years. I think we can also just apply some of our common sense here and say that if affordability and these types of challenges are driving people out of the country, the situation has only gotten much worse since 2020, and we'll be sitting here in a few years' time once Statistics Canada makes the latest data available, and we'll be in even greater shock at the number of people who are saying thanks, no thanks to Canada.
Just switching gears for a second here, we've also seen some polling data, including from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights yesterday, that shows that Canadians are increasingly feeling uneasy about immigration. In fact, more Canadians, according to that survey from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, believe that immigration is not something Canada benefits from. When you look at that data, what is your response to that? Maybe I could get both of you to respond to that. And why do you think we've seen this reversal on whether or not people feel that immigration is benefiting us?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, why don't you go first?
Okay, fine. You're buying lunch, though.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So, public opinion in Canada, with respect to immigration has crashed to 30-year lows following basically 2 years of a steady drumbeat of commentary in the media among commentators predominantly that make the assumption, which is superficially reasonable, but I think technically incorrect, that all of our failings when it comes to housing and healthcare are simply attributable to the number of people that are in the country. And I think this is just a false assessment. It's understandable that Canadians who are feeling squeezed are looking for ways to understand why they're feeling squeezed. And if they're not optimistic about the country's ability to grow and prosper more in the future, then it makes sense to want to reduce the number of mouths that are nibbling away at the pie. Having said all of that, when immigration last spiked in Canada in the late 80s and early 90s, housing prices decreased by 25%. We don't talk about that very much. When housing prices in a city like Toronto doubled between 2001 and 2014, even when immigration levels were lower, no one blamed that on the population. We blamed it on other factors. So I think this is an understandable but unfortunately simplistic explanation for the problems that face Canada, which are unfortunately much more deeper problems of our own making. That we really need to resolve. The other irony, of course, is that the immigrants that we are bringing in are precisely selected for their ability to help us resolve these things. They are brought in for their skills in healthcare. There's a special set of economic immigrants who are selected for their ability in the trades to help, alleviate housing construction shortages and increase the pace of housing construction. And these are the people that are being driven away precisely by these exact same issues of expensive housing, etc. So we need to recognize that immigrants are not just takers. Immigrants are highly selected. We reject 96% of the economic immigrants that apply to come to Canada. We are incredibly selective. The people who are coming with advanced degrees and global experience, often from countries that know how to do things better than we do. We have people who come from India and wonder how an advanced, rich country like Canada still runs its healthcare system on fax machines. We have a lot to learn from these people who are coming from other countries, and if they are being driven away, that is not something to celebrate because we have one less renter to compete with. That also means that we have one less carpenter to build the housing, one less trucker to keep commerce going. If we remove 10% of the immigrants from Canada, from a hospital, for example, we'd remove 10% from the waiting room and 35% from the staff room, and I'd invite Canadians to do the math on which option is beneficial for our future.
Okay, next question, Stuart Benson, Hill Times.
Hi there. Yes, so Dave sort of covered my question, so I'll just go to my second one. Is just, we have seen that, like, I think it was TBO report earlier this week or last week had reset that with these numbers, our housing will, like, our housing gap will be reduced. So is this a question of that our numbers are too low for how many that we're bringing in and retaining, or is this more just for people who are looking at this and maybe not as sold on seeing this as an issue? Is this are you just saying that we just need to work harder on retaining the immigrants that we do bring in rather than a sort of any comment on the actual goals that we have? Are you calling for do you think we should not have reduced those numbers, I guess is what I'm getting at?
Okay, so we're not here calling for a specific target of immigration to go up or down. I'm simply trying to say that there are lots of moving parts. For example, we talk about the housing needs that are going down. I think there was also a report out this week from CMHC showing that housing starts in Ontario are declining precipitously. So yeah, we're having fewer people coming, but look, all of a sudden we're also building far fewer homes. It is too simplistic and unrealistic to explain such a complex phenomenon like a housing crisis, which is 30 plus years in the making, based on the number of people who happen to come in July of this year or even over the last year or two. Does that contribute to the phenomenon? Of course it does, but is it the cause of the phenomenon? No. So we need to take a broader view. What we're talking about when it comes to retention is that the Government of Canada, provinces within Canada who control a lot of immigration selection themselves, especially Quebec, but also the other provinces, are picking people to address specific needs that they identify within their economy and society. That's how you get in, is by being very well educated, very experienced, and not just in general, but specifically in areas which individual provinces say we have a need for. If there is such a need for these people and they are not staying, then I submit that this need goes unfulfilled and that this is a net negative for Canada.
Stuart, do you have a follow-up? I guess not.
Was it something I said?
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Okay.
Okay, next question, Emily Bergeron, Presse Canadienne.
Oui, bonjour.
Hello. You said earlier that Francophones, immigrants that leave Ontario, very often they do so because they do not find themselves in a community with a critical mass in terms of Francophone-speaking people. Now, have you observed via your data whether Francophone immigrants in Sudbury, for instance, leave in far greater numbers? I don't presently have access to specific data in terms broken down by Ontario cities. This was my opinion, speculation on my part, when it comes to critical mass of Francophones. But what we are observing, and it warrants further investigation in future, Francophones will leave the country more so than Anglophones. Now, if Canada feels that Francophone immigrants are a category that has priority, well then, the loss of these Francophone immigrants reveals that there's something awry with our strategy.
For this, but I'm not sure it's in the report.
Yeah, so we do have some data on cities, but it's not specific to the Francophone population. And I just wanted to add regarding the critical mass question, it's also relative critical mass in the sense that there is a big population in Quebec, so people would want to move there. So that is sort of expected. And at the same time, however, it's also the lack of support services that might be a particular issue here. Many immigrants move to small communities and they stay there because they have the support services that they require. For the same reason, Francophones might not feel that they have those support services, but it's in relative terms, it is available in places like Quebec. So they prefer.
Another important finding, for the average immigrant, if they leave, it's 5 years. 5 years after arrival. For Francophones, it's their second year. They leave after 2 years. So it's a very urgent matter that we need to deal with. If we provide settlement services, if we welcome them, we provide them with services, financial, cultural, whatever, we have to act very quickly so that those very first years, and for the Francophone, it has to be that first year, that these first years be a very positive experience. Otherwise, according to our findings, Francophones will leave after 2 years to explore other options. Thank you. You also talked about, to one of my colleagues, that it would be interesting to have a retention target. Do you have a percentage in mind? And I would also ask, if I may, when it comes to Francophone immigrants who leave Canada, this is over a 25-year period. Did I misunderstand? That is correct. Our forecasts over a long term based on existing data and trends as we've observed them. And your first question had to do was your retention targets. What could be the target? Any ideas? Well, I don't control the government of Canada nor its policies. Suffice it to say that it is important to consider, to realize that there is a percentage of immigrants who leave Canada in greater numbers from one year to the next. And when they do so, well, of course, they're not here to contribute their talent, their energy, to ensure the prosperity of the country. If the government has set targets on immigration with immigrants arriving in Canada, perhaps the government of Canada could come up with retention targets, because without a target, without a number, it's very hard to understand how important, how urgent it is for us to improve our performance as regards retention. Are there any further questions?
Going, gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.